Hello, global gardeners. Welcome to another Gardening Monday. Great to have everybody here today. For me, it is a blustery, windy, but warm day in Colorado. And I'm glad to be inside right now. I was out earlier today and almost got blown over. It's that time of year for us. We're going to be doing a lot of talking about gardening today with a focus on watering, which can be a challenge, especially for some of us in dry regions, and maybe even more challenging for those of you in wet regions. So all that is upcoming in the next 90 minutes. We'll be answering all your garden questions and sharing all the information we have to pass back and forth. Our wonderful moderators, Heidi and Jay, are already with us today, and Jay has asked a question, wanting to know about any experience with growing sweet potatoes on a trellis. I'm a small space gardening and new to sweet potato gardening. So it depends on the sweet potato. There are some varieties of sweet potatoes that might only get 15 or 18 inches tall, in which case you really don't need to worry about trellising them. They can stay relatively bushy, but you can put a short trellis just to keep the vines, the stems, and the leaves from spreading out, especially in a small space. But if you're growing a sweet potato that is a vining sweet potato, it could get 12 or 15 feet long, depending on how much space you have. And so while we're harvesting the sweet potatoes from underground, it's the foliage that you would be trellising. You wouldn't be trellising it for the harvest. You're just trying to keep it under control so it doesn't take over your garden. And so trellis it like you would a tomato vine, an indeterminate tomato vine, same basic idea. You can have a flat trellis like a fence or a cattle panel and train the vine up, that kind of trellis. You can also do like I do in my videos where you can train the vines up twine or string and actually tie them or clip them and grow them vertically. So growing sweet potatoes vertically is actually relatively easy and a pretty good idea if you are in a short space. Now, for a lot of people growing sweet potatoes, they just let them sprawl everywhere. And that's the typical way of doing it, but try trellising. Try just training those vines up, whatever you're using in other areas of your garden as a trellis, and you should have good results without too much trouble at all. It's so nice to see everybody here. A lot of the regulars checking in. I saw Jwala check in after a trip to India, and thank you so much. Nice to have you back. Thank you for that super chat donation. We've missed you. You were here every week for a couple months, I think. So I hope you had a great trip to India, and it's always nice to have you back and participating. And there was a comment by Baby Root, who has tried my beet recipe, the fermented beet video I did a couple years ago, and loved it. So I'm glad you did that. Beets are high on my list of things to grow in the garden because they're so easy to pickle and ferment. So I'm glad you liked that recipe because it's my favorite as well. And had a question from 4:39 p.m. at the very beginning asking about sunflowers and wondering if it's true that they'll kill plants near them. And yes, it is true. Sunflowers are allelopathic, which means they exude chemicals that do inhibit the growth of plants nearby. So take a look if you're growing sunflowers this year, and you'll probably notice that there aren't any weeds at the base of the sunflower. So if you grow them in your garden right next to some of your vegetable plants, they might inhibit the growth of the vegetable plants. They're great for pollinators. They're great for beauty. They're great for harvesting the seeds and to eat the seed heads, but just be aware that it could pose a problem if you have them as a companion plant side by side. Now, if you put plants in place, a plant is more likely to survive than a seedling, but I would still separate them. So I think growing sunflowers outside your garden beds is a great idea. I wouldn't necessarily grow them in the same bed that I'm growing my food crops or anything else that I want to survive. So hope that helps. And so I wanted to focus a little bit on the watering today, because watering is one of those issues that I have so many questions about. New gardeners in particular have a lot of questions about watering, and watering tends to be the most common problem in the garden. Most of our plants are dying because we overwater them or underwater them. And you've heard me say that before. That's a cause of a lot of issues. Blossom end rot on tomatoes, which is a calcium deficiency, caused by a calcium deficiency. Most of our soils, if not all of our soils, have enough calcium to support tomato growth. But when the soil is either too dry or too wet, well, the tomato plant just can't absorb the calcium from the soil, and so blossom end rot results. Yellowing of leaves, curling of leaves, same type of thing, often caused because of the soil drying out or the soil being too saturated. And so it's so common for us to get out to garden and water. We have to, most of us on a daily basis. But how much do you really think about how you're watering your plants? And recognizing that overwatering and underwatering is the most common problem, what do you do to avoid those issues? Now, I've recommended before, and I just did it yesterday as a matter of fact, take your finger and stick it into the soil to see how moist your soil is. I've used moisture meters. They tend to last for about 3 days before they don't seem to work anymore. Your finger is really the best way. And you can just stick it straight in and that'll give you an initial indication. I like to dig a little hole in various beds at various times of the week and the month and the year, and just see how the soil moisture is holding up. Is it staying consistent? And you go out to water, you may recognize that you really don't need to water. I think one of the biggest problems that we create for ourselves and don't understand why it's creating the problem is that we get on a schedule, especially in the summer. I love going out first thing in the garden or first thing in the day. So I'm out in the garden at 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock in the morning before it gets too hot, and I'm going out to water before it gets too hot. Well, we get in that mindset, we get on that schedule, and we think that we're going out every day to water, so we should water. This is where the problem comes in. Watering every single day may be too much water. And that's why so many of our beds end up getting overwatered, because we just give them the same amount every day on a regular schedule, and the plants may not need that much. Or conversely, for those of us who live in a place like Colorado on the Front Range, we'll have single-digit humidity during the summer. So we'll have days that will be over 100 degrees, about 38 Celsius, and 8 or 9% humidity. On those days, especially with the wind that we get, we might need to water twice a day, because the morning watering is going to evaporate in that low humidity, high wind, hot environment. So the schedule of watering every morning may not be enough. So start thinking about those kind of issues as you water your garden, and be more precise. Give your plants what they need, not what you have chosen to give them. So, okay, let's go ahead and see who we have and what questions we have. Nice to see you, Urban Chicken Mama. Loved your video with your daughter and grandbabies. Oh, thank you. That was my green stock Mother's Day video. I hope you share updates as they plant their green stock and it grows for them. That's a good idea. So for channel members, you can participate in our Facebook group. And my daughter Kiri actually yesterday posted a picture on Facebook in her regular stream that they filled it all up and they put the plants in yesterday. So I'm going to be sure and ask her to post that up for the Facebook stream. But for those of you who are not members that are not on Facebook, absolutely, I'll give some regular updates. I'm also starting a video with a friend who has one on her patio. Doesn't have space for a garden. She's just using a green stock on the patio. So you can expect updates for how to grow on a patio, and then also to show you what Kiri and my granddaughters are doing with theirs on their patio as well. So thank you. I appreciate you saying that. I like making videos like that. They don't get a ton of views. I don't make them to go viral on YouTube. I just like to share what others are doing, especially my family members. So thank you for saying that, because it is fun. I talk a lot about doing garden journals and tracking what you're doing in the garden. Well, I think garden journals can also be used to track what others are doing, the lessons you learn, the stories, the enjoyment. When you visit someone else's garden and you see something they're doing, or you like something they're doing, or it just makes you feel good, make note of those kind of things in your garden journal. And so for me, my videos are a form of garden journaling. And so I'll make videos that are a little more personal, like that one, so that I can share with you, but also so that I can look at them and over the years past remember what those times were. I have a video on how to make seed tape that my granddaughters were in, and that was, I think, 4 years ago. And so they were much smaller, and just little kids. And so I'll make these videos periodically for myself as well, just so I can track the growth of my granddaughters. I think that's a lot of fun. So I thank you. I appreciate that. Lisa's saying, does anyone have problems with strawberries in green stalks? I planted bare root and half died. I can't figure out what happened. So yes, and I had planned a video on how to grow strawberries in the green stalk. And I'm not going to be able to do that video because I planted the strawberries at the end of last year and they didn't make it through. Now, doing a little more research and seeing some other videos out there and some other blogs, it's the same with most containers. Growing strawberries in a container can be difficult if you're in zone 4, 5, or 6 in particular. And especially if you live in a dry region like those of us here in Colorado. The containers are quick to dry out, and they are quick to freeze. And for a strawberry, that rapid freezing and that dry soil over the winter, in most cases, can spell doom. Now, I was diligent in protecting my strawberries. I watered them every time the soil began, or the days began to warm, and I thought the soil might be thawing out, and my strawberries still didn't survive. It wasn't the green stalk that was the reason for them not surviving. It's just strawberries don't do well in containers in cold regions. I have seen gardeners in zones 7 and 8 have great success growing strawberries year-round in the green stalk or in any other container. So I'm not sure exactly where you at. I don't remember, Lisa, but my guess is that your winter is just too harsh, like mine, to grow strawberries in containers. I've tried growing strawberries in other containers in the past and not had success, which is why I wanted to try them with the green stalk this year and still didn't have success. So I love the green stalk. They're great for growing a lot of plants, but I'm just not convinced in zone 5 in particular that it's the best way to grow them. And Olivia's asking, is lavender the same way in a pot in 5B? Yes. And so lavender, and so most of the lavenders you're going to find are recommended for zone 6 and above. Now, I grow Munstead and Hidcote varieties, which are good down to zone 5. And I've had some good success with that in the ground. And so there's something about the moisture and temperature in the ground that tends to make the plants do better. They can spread their roots out. You put a mulch on top, and it's a more stable environment. You put those same plants in pots, and I would recommend that you consider it being at least one zone higher to have success. So for a Hidcote or Munstead lavender that might do well in the ground in zone 5, I would say you probably need to be at least zone 6 for those to do well in a pot. And rosemary's the same way. I have the same issues with rosemary. I can sometimes get it to survive the winter, but I can never get my rosemary to survive in a pot over the course of a winter. So there are a number of those kind of plants that are like right on the edge of the zone they do best in, and they just won't do well in a lower zone in a pot. So it's you can still grow them in a pot. You just need to bring them into a protected area in the winter so they're not exposed to the extremes that some of us have during the winter months. And then you might be able to grow them in containers. So experiment a little bit, move the pots around, bring some in, leave some out, see what your results are. But I personally haven't had a lot of success with container growing just because of the harshness of my winter climate. And then I watch a video with someone else doing the exact same thing, 2 or 3 zones higher, and they make it look so easy. So much about gardening really does come down to our particular zone. TJ the Hawk says, any reason you think my Greek oregano keeps dying in zone 6, New Hampshire? Says it's hardy down to zone 4. It's in the ground. Oregano is usually a pretty tough plant, and the oregano that I've planted last year is coming back great this year in my zone 5. So yes, normally it is hardy down to zone 4 or 5. And I actually had oregano to show how hardy it is based on the previous discussion. I've actually had oregano in pots come back over the winter because it is such a hardy plant. So I would suspect it might be something to do with your soil, the pH of the soil, the moisture level of your soil, how much it's drying out, or maybe it's saturated, maybe it's contaminated, maybe it doesn't have the nutrients the plants need, though oregano doesn't need a lot of nutrients. So take a look at the soil. If there are other plants growing in that area, it sounds like a weird problem for just the oregano to have an issue. So you might have some problems with other plants. Go ahead and dig it up and put it in pots and move it someplace else and see if that solves the problem as well. That could be a good indicator that there's something wrong with the soil in that spot. And I've had that. Gardens have their little weird zones where some plants do well in one spot, they don't do well in another spot. Sometimes it could be as simple as just something contaminated the soil in that location, and anything you plant there might be a problem. So there's a couple ideas. It would be unusual. Now, typically in New Hampshire, you're probably going to have acidic soil, low pH, and so it could just be that the pH is too low. So maybe consider adding lime. Oregano does tend to like a more neutral pH, so that could be a problem. Look into some of those things and see if maybe that might help you out a little bit as you roll forward. Karen saying, good morning from southwest of Thunder Bay, Canada. Cherry seedling came up white and died now. When and how should I plant my hollyhock seeds in zone 3? So hollyhock seeds, take a look at the seed packet for sure. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, but you can usually put those in around your last frost date. And so I'm guessing that's coming up here in a couple weeks, but take a look at the seed packet. It should give you an idea of when the best time is to put in those hollyhock seeds for the best results. And a lot of it comes down to the last frost date. And I'm about a week and a half away from my last frost date. And the long range forecast calls for no nights below freezing for me, though I think it's on Thursday or Friday, it's supposed to drop down above freezing but not by much. And so this is one of those, I've talked about it before. You have to be careful when you're approaching your last frost date and everything looks good. And even though the forecast says it's supposed to be above freezing, I've just had too much experience where that one day you expect to be above freezing, it drops below. And it's usually right before your average last frost date. So I'm still holding off on a lot of the stuff I'm going to put in the ground just because I'm hesitant. And so for seeds, like a hollyhock seed that you might normally put in the ground 2 or 3 weeks before the last frost date or on the last frost date, depending on what kind of roller coaster variations you have, take a look at the long range forecast. And I always tend to buffer by a week or two just to give myself an extra flexibility for my plants so they don't get that severe temperatures drop that always happens when you don't want it to happen. So, okay, let's see. DLR 978, oregano is an excellent choice for making fermented plant juice. That's a good idea. That's something I've never done before. But oregano, I love oregano. And I've got it growing, I think I have it in 6 different areas of my garden. It's a wonderful plant for a lot of good reasons. And so fermented plant juice, there's an opportunity for you to think about doing something like that. Hi, Tammy. I've seen it recommended to only grow things in pots that are hardy 2 zones colder than yours. My zone 5 garden would need zone 3 plants hardy in pots. Yeah, and that's what I was talking about. I've had success with protection and extra attention 1 zone higher, but yeah, I think that's a good recommendation. Just to be on the safe side, 2 zones higher is probably a really good idea when you're talking about plants. Greg says, my average last frost date is May 7th, and I was ready to start transplanting, but saw that the forecast for tonight is lows in the upper 30s. Glad I didn't transplant much. Too close. Exactly my point. At upper 30s, which would put us about 3 degrees Celsius. That's just too close to me. One thing goes wrong and you just lose all of the effort that you've made. So I'm glad you were able to avoid that potential problem. It's, you might not get everything that you want in the ground when you want it, but if you're a little bit late because of the weather and it gets in the ground, then it's growing. If you get it in the ground too early and the weather comes and kills it, it's a lot of wasted effort. So a little bit of patience and delaying some of those activities really can be beneficial in the long run, I think. And so SC is asking a good question. What kind of mulching will protect gardens from constant rains? So there's a couple ways to look at mulches, and it depends on how you garden. So raised beds tend to drain better than in-ground beds in areas that get more rain. And it's all about gravity and just the water flowing through the soil, and it might be pooling at the bottom, but the top part of the raised beds where we're growing will dry out faster than the ground in most areas with a lot of rain. And so you can approach your mulch from a couple different perspectives. Choose a mulch that allows for quick draining if the bed you're in has good drainage. Or choose your mulch so that it absorbs some of that rain if you might be in an area where it doesn't drain away as quickly. And so wood chips, for instance, wood chips can absorb quite a bit of moisture, and that might be an option in an area with a lot of rain where the wood chips would do some work absorbing some of that rain. Now, it only works to a point because once the wood chips are saturated, well, they're not going to absorb anymore. Now they're going to hold that water near the plants at the surface. So now it comes down to what kind of plants you're growing. We get gully washer thunderstorms in summer, and they'll drop inches of rain in a couple hours occasionally. So I use a lot of wood chip mulch around my bushes and trees for that reason. They'll absorb some of the water and they'll help the ground from becoming too saturated. Most of the time, however, especially in my vegetable garden, I want that rain to seep through. I'm using straw, which can also absorb some water, and dried grass, which can also absorb some water, and that works pretty well. In other areas of the garden, and you see this a lot throughout the U.S. Southwest, you might want to consider a mulch like a gravel or rock mulch. For drainage, the rain's going to roll through, but as soon as the sun comes out, those rocks are going to warm up, heat up, and that will accelerate the evaporation of the water in the soil. And so it depends on where you live and how much rain you're getting and what kind of weather follows the rain. But there's a couple ideas to help out with the mulch. And another one of those experimental kind of things. Try a couple different mulches and see if there's something that you prefer over another. If you get a lot of sustained rain, now you may be thinking or may need to think about your bed design, what kind of beds you're using, maybe a preference towards the raised beds, and then also drainage in the garden. Give a place for that water to go, and then you don't have to worry so much about the type of mulch because the water will be running off. And so this ties back into what I want to talk about today as far as watering and why getting on a schedule can be a problem. Because if the rain comes, how does that affect your schedule? Do you still water the same after a rain? Probably not. Most of us see the rain and think, oh, I don't need to water today, or I don't need to water tomorrow. That's often appropriate. However, how much rain did you get? And at what point of the day did the rain come? So I've seen this in my garden where I know the rain is coming, there's a thunderstorm forecast, and I'm going to wait on the rain so that I don't go out and water my garden because water's becoming even more and more expensive in many regions of the U.S. So I don't want to have to pay to water the garden and then have a thunderstorm water it for me. That happens, not as often as it used to, but I'll go out after the thunderstorm to see just how much rain actually made it into the soil. Because when you're using a mulch that's going to absorb some of the rain, like we were just talking about, and if the thunderstorm is followed by very hot, dry conditions, which is not unusual in my area, a lot of that water evaporates pretty quickly. And so I've gone out to the garden an hour or two after rain from a thunderstorm, and the soil was barely damp in the top 1 inch of soil because it dried out so quickly. The roots are now down lower. The roots are 3, 4, 5, 6 inches deep. So even if you get a rain, even if you get a lot of rain in a short period, that still may not be enough to get the water to the plants. So don't assume that just because you have a rain that that's going to be enough to keep your plants happy. You still have to get out, still have to check the soil. And I've actually gone out after rain, after a thunderstorm, and watered because it didn't rain as much as I had expected. Also, with that thought in mind, watering near a rainstorm or the time of a rainstorm, if the forecast for me is that I'm going to get a rain, but it might only drop 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch of rain, that, again, may not be enough for the plants. So I'll go out and I'll actually water my garden before the rainstorm. And so if it rains and the mulch is dry, the mulch is going to absorb that rain and it probably won't even get to the soil. If it rains enough to get through the mulch into the soil, but it's just a very light rain, it's probably not going to be enough to dampen the soil. But if you've watered already, and so the mulch is already moist, the soil is already moist, now when it rains, that rain is going to seep right past the compost into the soil, and it's actually going to flow through the soil and give you that extra 1/2 inch deeper down. And so if I see 1/2 inch of rain coming, rather than get half an inch of rain in this drought-stricken area I'm in, and most of that half inch is going to evaporate, I'll water, and then that half inch will end up going all the way into the soil, and I'll get essentially an extra half inch of rain deeper into the soil. So that's one of those little tricks that has really helped me to harvest and use the rain that we do get, rather than just accepting that it's going to evaporate in my hot, dry conditions. So something to think about for that. Laura has a suggestion for a video. What do you do with garden beds during a year you don't have time to garden? What cover crop or just mulch? Water. I'm pregnant and I'm not fill all my beds. That's a really good question. And I was just thinking about that this weekend. And so at the end of the show today, I'll talk a little bit about some of my thoughts along these lines specifically, and the specific idea about not being discouraged when you start having some of these issues and how I approach it, because this is kind of the mode I'm in right now. Now, I think I mentioned, it's a couple months ago in one of these live streams, as we were talking about planning for the garden and setting priorities. And I had said that one of my priorities this year is building the garden, constructing beds, the pathways, putting in the big pots and the containers, a lot of those kind of things. So for me as well, this year, I will not be planting as many beds as a typical year, because I just have so much building and creating to do. So yes, I am planning a video along those lines, because I recognize this weekend that I'm just not going to be able to do as much as I would like to do, because my priorities are different. I'm going to be doing different things in the garden. So thank you for that idea. It definitely ties in with some of the thoughts I've already had, and you're exactly on the right track. Cover crops and mulches are typically what I do in the beds that I don't plant. And so you can expect to see a video. I wasn't planning on doing it until midsummer, but maybe I'll move it up based on your suggestion and start talking about what to do in the beds that you're not going to be planting. You should still cover the soil. Critical. Even if there's no plants growing in the bed, you should still cover the soil. But the interface between the roots and the soil microbes are so important that if you can have a plant growing in a bed, it's far superior than just a mulch. The type of plant often doesn't matter, but for the soil improvement purposes, choosing the right kind of cover crop that can be then used later on as a soil improvement mechanism is a good idea. So great suggestion. Thank you for that, Laura. And I would say don't worry about it. Just plant what you can plant and make it as easy on yourself as possible. I have a video from about a year ago, not quite a year ago. So it was about cover crops, and I had that blend. Check that out. There's a blend from True Leaf Market that has a number of different cover crop seeds in it. And I use that for my fall cover crop plantings, but it could just as easily be used for the spring cover crop plantings as well. And throw it in. Most of those plants are really hardy, and they'll take over the bed, cover it, protect it, add mulch as well. And then next year, after you're able to get it in the garden, you can deal with the cover crops at that time. So hope that helps. And still get outside and get your baby exposed to the wonder of the outdoors before they get to help you in the garden. And I think that's one of those things, nice, pleasant environment for mother and infant, both in the womb and outside the womb. But the garden is a wonderful place for that to happen. So, hi, Susan Baker. Good morning to everyone from Central Florida. Nice to have you here. Let's see, Jay Dixon, you are such a pro on top of things, sharing the millipedes and pest control organics. I'll have to check that out. based on, I didn't see the comment by Catherine, but I appreciate you being on top of things. Okay, let's see what else we have. Eileen says, the gift of ignorance gave me 100% success with overwintering my strawberries in my grain stock. Somehow I thought I was supposed to keep them in the garage and water every 3 to 4 weeks. Good for you. And Albion, I actually have some Albion strawberries in the ground, but good. And so there you have it. You can grow strawberries in a grain stock if everything is in their favor to primarily include the climate, even if you don't know what you're doing. So I'm glad you had success, Eileen. I'm going to keep trying to do things like that. And as I've said many times before, we learn so much from our mistakes and failures that it really helps guide everything else we're doing in gardening. And strawberries in a green stock, for some of us, definitely put us on that journey. In the Garden with Eli and Kate have joined us. Nice to see you here. You guys are talking about rain and I couldn't join in. I've been so jumpy, desperate to chat about gardening in a rainy climate. So that's nice. Yeah, so Eli and Kate live in Scotland in the UK, and they've had the opposite of what some of us are having. Lots and lots of rain. Last year was a crazy year for rain in many regions of the UK. I had rain last week, I think it was on Wednesday, just a little bit. I'm not even sure if it was measurable. Maybe a 1/4 inch of rain. That was the first rain we've had this year. So it's May and we got our first rain. There is no more rain in our forecast for the next 2 weeks. So we have the opposite problem. No rain whatsoever, which is why we have to get out in our garden and water. So for those of you like Eli and Kate who are dealing with the rainy climate conditions, it's still gardening. We still have our issues. We still have to get our plants growing, but there are many, many days I wish we were in a rainy climate so that I wouldn't have the same issues. And so in a rainy climate, it can become even more important because those of us that don't get rain just know we need to water our plants. So we're going to go out and water our plants. Those of you in a rainy climate may get in that situation where you get into that pattern where you don't water your plants. And then after a couple weeks of no rain, the rains stop or slow down. Be careful about that. Be careful about falling into a pattern because your plants get to the point where they're watered naturally. At some point, you're going to have to get out and do the watering again. You still need to get out and check the soil so that you know when to do that. And don't just rely on an open calendar. Like 2 weeks after it rains, I start watering. You need to check your soil. Now, I like hand watering. I like to actually get out with my water wand connected to my hose and hand water everything, to include my trees, because I like getting up close to the plants. I like seeing what's happened. And there, I can tell you how many times I've discovered a pest in the garden, an insect pest, during one of my morning waterings. And when you see a single insect pest and you pluck it off and kill it, you might never have a problem with that pest. If you get out and water like I have recently, I start seeing the bees and the ladybugs start to show up. That gives me a good feeling like, okay, things are in balance. The garden's looking pretty good. I can see, I really don't have a problem with disease. But if you have something like blight on your tomato plants, there are early blight issues you might have. If you can catch that early, you can stop it from infesting other plants and maybe causing that plant to really have a tragic downfall. By getting out on a regular basis with your plants, you can see these kind of problems develop early so that you can control them early. That's a big reason why I like to hand water, so that I can inspect my garden every single day. There's nothing wrong with drip irrigation. There's nothing wrong with putting your sprinklers on a timer. But if that's the way you're watering, I encourage you to get out in the garden as often as possible so that you can get close to it and see what's happening with the individual plants that you're growing. Gardening is so complicated with so many variabilities. And so it's easy for us to take out watering as a variable. We just put it on a schedule. We just schedule ourselves. We water. Now we don't need to worry about it anymore. Well, there are still those other factors, and you can tie watering into that observation and that analysis every single day. And I like watering. Now, right now, for me, as my plants are just starting to emerge in spring and the beds are waking up, I spent twice last week an hour each time I watered. And so in the summer, when my garden is planted out and fully growing, it's 90 minutes to 2 hours for me to hand water the whole garden. But that's variable. And so think about this as well. You should only give your plants as much water as they need, and different plants are going to need different amounts of water. So my fruit trees that are just waking up right now, I'm watering 3 times a week. But that's mainly because we haven't had any rain and my soil is extremely dry. So I'm giving my fruit trees a good soaking 3 times a week. A lot of the other plants in my garden are being watered 5 days a week. So the pots and I just put my blueberries in over the weekend, and I had that video where I put those columnar apple trees in. Those pots are being watered 3 to 4 times, 3 to 4 times a week right now. My beds that have strawberries growing in them and some of the other beds with cover crops, they're getting watered 2 to 3 times per week because the mulch is thick on top and the cover crops are helping to keep the soil from evaporating. So I don't need to water those as much. My garlic bed, where the garlic is now actively growing, I'm watering about 5 times a week. So even though I'm getting out and watering every single day, what I'm watering, how much I'm watering, and when I'm watering is variable. Every bed is treated individually. So don't think that you have to water everything the same. It's okay to have a very specific plan in your garden and give the specific plants what they need at the specific times. The seeds in the beds in my garden right now, and the seeds I'll be starting in the next couple of weeks as well, they're being watered 2 or 3 times a day so that I can keep the soil moist. And especially with these really windy, hot days that we had last week and the week before and this next week, I'm beginning to wonder as these seedlings emerge if I may need to go to 3 or 4 times a day for some of the seeds that I'm going to be growing in the beds. You have to look at your individual conditions and choose what's best for your seeds and your plants. And that's okay. Don't think you're doing something wrong because one bed gets more water than another. That's exactly what you should be doing if that bed needs more water as opposed to some of the other plants. So some ways to water. I like soaker hoses. I like drip irrigation. However, because I do succession planting and I'm always changing up my beds, I'm not as big a fan of drip irrigation in the vegetable garden because you have to keep changing the emitters over the course of a season. And I just don't like to work that hard. But it's definitely an option in beds with a few bigger plants. So if you've got a bed with like 6 tomato plants in it, set up a drip irrigation system and make it as easy as possible on you. You still need to check the soil. You still need to mulch. You still need to give the plants what they need. but that might be a little easier on you. For my pumpkins and my squashes in my hugelkultur bed, for instance, I'll just lay a soaker hose out because all of the plants in that bed need the same amount of water. And so I can just put the soaker hose, turn the water on, go do something else in the garden, come back 5 or 10 minutes later, and they've got the water that they need. So how you water, it's totally up to how you garden as well. I'm not a big fan, especially in areas like mine where you have to pay for water and it's windy and hot. I'm not a big fan of overhead watering where you just put the sprinkler on, because for me, I don't need to water my pathways. It's just wasted water. Be direct. Put the water at the plants, and so that the water at the plants get down to the roots of those plants, and then really try to avoid watering other areas where there aren't plants and there aren't roots, and where wastage could literally cost you. So I'm not a big fan of overhead watering. However, in an area like I'm developing now with my pollinator garden, where I've got a lot of seeds sown from the winter, plants are just starting to come up right now. It's an open area with plants everywhere. I really don't know where the seeds are and what plants are going to sprout. Then I'll set up an overhead sprinkler to just water the whole space so that the soil is evenly moist for those seeds to germinate and for those young plants to grow. So because all of those plants require essentially the same amount of water, an overhead sprinkler can work in that kind of garden bed area. I'll do the same thing where I'll set up an overhead sprinkler for my little mini orchard with the fruit trees. As the trees get bigger, those roots are going to start spreading more and more. So right now I can go out with my hand wand and water my fruit trees for a diameter of about 4 feet. That's where the roots are. But pretty soon those roots are going to be extending out farther from the tree than that. Watering the whole area makes more sense. And you see this especially in the time that I lived in California when they're watering the orchards. That's what they'll do. They have their sprinkler set up and they just water the whole orchard so that all of the ground is wet, because those tree roots are spreading everywhere. Putting a drip emitter on a tree is really not a good idea because the roots are far away from where that drip emitter is going to be. Anticipate where the roots are, and that'll also influence how you water your plants. Hi, Sally. Last year, all my plants burned up because of our altitude and heat. Even with really regular watering, this year I purchased 49% shade cloth. Great idea, and that's actually on my list to talk about with watering as well. So I have talked about shade cloth before, and I've shown it in a couple of my videos. That is a great idea in addition to mulch for reducing your watering requirements in summer. In heat and wind and dry climates, the shade cloth is going to reduce the soil evaporation. If the soil evaporation is reduced, it means you need to water less. So I hope you have better success this year with that shade cloth. I'm guessing you're going to notice a marked improvement from what happened last year. Okay, SJK. Bought a green stock for my daughter, sending best wishes from Wisconsin. Well, thank you. That's nice. I hope they love it. I have no doubt they will. If you saw the video with my granddaughters, how happy they were, and so the pictures that Curie posted, they're probably more happy with the plants in the green stock now that they actually have something growing. So it's just such a nice way to get the family involved and participating, and because of the compactness of the green stock, that's one reason why I really like it for family growing, especially with kids. They, at least with my granddaughter, when they get out in the garden, they wander, and sometimes it's hard to keep them focused on putting the seeds in the ground or helping me water or whatever the activity happens to be. I don't have that issue with the green stock, quite honestly, because everything is right there and it spins And so they can just keep their full attention on the plants in the green stock. So it's anecdotal, but I find for the kids that the green stock actually works pretty well to keep them focused on what they're doing. So so Clayton's wondering, how do we water cauliflower out here in Colorado? So cauliflower, all plants, water at the roots, right where the plant is. Cauliflower is one of those kind of plants that if you water from above, it can actually cause some discoloration on the head. And so in Colorado, you don't want to waste water and discolor your cauliflower by watering it from above. And so when I water from hand, even with plants like broccoli and cauliflower, that's why I like to use my water wand, because I can get right down and release the water right at the base of the plant to then soak into the soil and benefit the roots. And so that's how I do it. I hand water those kind of plants with my water wand so that I'm not watering from above and I'm putting the water right down onto the soil so it can drain and benefit the roots. Cauliflower, especially as they start to grow bigger, cauliflowers can actually do well with soaker hoses, and you can set them up for drip irrigation because the plant does get big enough that a drip emitter can get that water right at the soil and the roots. So especially Colorado, water the soil. Don't water the plant, and you'll tend to have better results. Okay, ladies' garden and home had 3 days of rain. Good for you. And I wish I could say the same thing. It's I can't remember the last. Well, actually, I do remember. So it was May 4 years ago. So May of 4 years ago was extremely unusual in my region. We had rain every single day except for one during that year. I'm pretty sure it was 4 years ago. And so that's the last time I can remember that we had sustained rain over a period of days, and it was just extreme. We couldn't get out in the garden and do anything because it just kept raining every single day. So good for you that you've got 3 days in a row. And Eli and Kate are saying, we're never happy, are we? Too much rain or not enough? Exactly. So it's one of those things that you got to do with what you got and make the best of it. Terry got a green stalk on Thursday, worried about planting strawberries in it now. Love the family video. Thank you. So let's talk a little about strawberries. I've been working on a video for strawberries. I wanted to include planting the strawberries in the green stalk, so now I'm having to figure out how I'm going to modify this plan for strawberries. So strawberries essentially live on a 3-year cycle. In the first year, they're establishing the growth, they're getting some size, you'll get some harvest from them. In the second year, you'll probably get the most harvest. The strong plants will give you a lot of flowers, a lot of fruit. And then in the third year, it should still be a pretty good harvest, but they begin to falter a little bit. I lived in an area in California, just outside Merced, California, a lot of strawberries growing there. And so the farmers, the couple farmers fields in particular, used that basic cycle where they would put into the ground the strawberry plants that were already 1 year old, or in some cases 2 years old. So they were starting with the plants that were already bigger, and in their first year, they got massive harvests. And then they ripped all the plants out and did the same thing all over again. You can approach it that way. And so what I've been doing in my cinder block bed, actually, I let some strawberries send out a bunch of runners last year. And that's one of the things I'm planning to do this year. Those plants from last year that are a year old now, you can plant in your green stock or in a container or a raised bed, and they already have 1 year of growth. So you should be able to get relatively good harvest in this, their second year in a container system like a green stock. So if you can find plants and put it into a green stock, you don't have to worry about overwintering, because then if they die, you just do the same thing next year, just like those farmers in California. It's if you want to have your strawberries last for 3 years in the same container that you need to be concerned about your hardiness zones and whether you protect them over the winter or not. And so it's just something to think about in how you grow strawberries. You can still do strawberries in a green stock in a cold region. You just may need to do plants in early spring, and then you can get the harvest at the end of the year and maybe have to repeat the whole thing the next year. That's one of the ways I'm doing it, just because I know that I don't get away with much else. That's one of the things that will tend to work best for me. So, okay, let's see. I want to scroll. Hi, Norma. Hi from South Texas. I have a persimmon tree that has just started giving fruit, but it's not giving fruit. Haven't taken good care, so I want to know what's your recommendation. And so for trees that, and persimmon or any type of tree that you haven't taken care of, the first thing to do is take care of it. And so one reason why a lot of trees don't fruit as well as they did in the past is because they just got too many branches and they just get overloaded. It's too much for the plant to support, and then they just get stressed and they just don't fruit the way they used to fruit. So you might need to prune. You might need to prune out some branches. When it does start flowering and fruiting, you might want to thin out some of that fruit and just leave the best behind to get the best results. And so the key being here is give it attention. Prune it. Get the branches off. Get some of those extra blossoms and fruit off. Make sure that it's getting the water it needs. I see this a lot. You have an old tree. I see this a lot with apple trees, for instance. There are a lot of apple trees here in my area of Colorado in the mountains from settlers 130 years ago that would plant an apple tree. And then they moved away, the cabin disintegrated, but the apple tree is still there. Most of the time, it's not fruiting. It's because it's continually stressed. No one's taking care of it. No one's pruning it. It's not getting any additional water other than the natural rain. And you've already heard that we're not getting natural rain. So especially in South Texas, you probably need supplemental watering. And so what are you doing? Are you putting a sprinkler underneath the tree to make sure that that area and that soil is nice and moist? If you're not, you might want to consider doing that. And that can give a boost to an old tree that maybe hasn't really had any attention paid to it. Now it loves your attention and it will reward you for that. So it's one of those things that, one of my basic beliefs is a good garden grows where the good gardener goes. And that holds true with trees and small plants and the pests and everything else. If you're out paying attention to your plants and giving them what they need, your garden is going to reward you. And so an old persimmon tree in South Texas may be difficult to grow, but it just needs a little bit extra attention, and I bet you that you'll have some good success with it. So hope that helps. Get out there and do it. And so this was also on my list to talk about today, Sheena's Garden. Do a water catchment system of any sort. And so that's a great idea. And so especially if you get a lot of rain. And so Tony O'Neill did, from the Simplified Gardening channel, did a video a month or two ago of the system he set up. And I just forget, hundreds and hundreds of gallons of water that he can catch off of the gutters that he has installed on his grow rooms or his greenhouses. They're polytunnels, but the same idea, where he's got these structures that will catch the rain and put them into these big cubes he has and use that water for the garden. So even in a wet region, collecting water can be a great idea because it's not going to rain forever. For those of you in dry regions, it can make even more sense. When you don't get a lot of rain, catch every drop that you can. Now, that being said, some of us, like those that live in Colorado, we actually have laws that prohibit catching and containing the rainwater when it falls. I can only have 2 55-gallon water containers to catch the rain. That's it. And until just a few years ago, we weren't even allowed that. So do be aware that there might be some legal limitations as to what you can contain. And so a water containment system is not necessarily a big cube that holds 150 gallons or a barrel that holds 55 gallons. It could be the design of your garden. And that's the approach I take. I'll run the downspouts and I'll run hoses off of the downspouts into my garden beds. So rather than just let the water fall through the gutters into the downspout and just flood the area next to my house, I'm directing that water to benefit my garden. So when I do get rain, that water is being specifically directed to my plants. You can also build your garden, especially if it's on a little bit of a slope, with swales that will collect the rain as it rolls down the hill. And so you're naturally allowing the water to pool near your plants. Great idea. It's work and you need to plan and design it, but it's a great way to get the most water from nature that you can. So completely agree with you. Definitely do a water catchment system, but the sort of system really depends on the legal system in your state, how much water you get, what kind of plants you're growing, and make it fit your garden specifically. But definitely consider doing that. Definitely. And one of the easiest ways to design a water containment system is just by using amended soil. Using compost in your soil will hold more water than a soil without compost. And so, in essence, that's a water containment system. It's not swales and barrels. It's just recognizing that soil with a lot of organic matter in it will hold more moisture than the soil that doesn't have the organic material in it. So lots of different ways that you can use the natural occurring rainwater. And of course, all that influences how much you're going to be watering and how much water the plants actually need. So Ibrahim is asking, what's your recommendations to minimize water evaporation or losses for severely dry regions like we have here in Oman or the Middle East in general? And so I've already talked about some of this. Shade cloth, coverings. So I have shown in recent video or talked about in recent videos the system I set up to put a cover over my entire garden space. Now, the primary reason for me to do that is for the hail that falls in the thunderstorms so that it doesn't damage my plants. But there's a secondary aspect to it as well. We get well over that 100 degrees here, 38 Celsius, on a regular basis in the summer with that low humidity. Very similar to Oman. Hot, dry, windy. And so I have my entire area, about 25 feet by 25 feet square, covered with a fabric to protect it from hail, but to also shade it. And so I recognized this year this last year, that covered bed area required less water than my open raised beds that were just a few feet away that weren't covered. So shade cloth can make a big difference. The organic material in the soil, absolutely. I have have lived here in Colorado and a few other places with very sandy soil. If your soil is very sandy, when you water it, that water is just going to drain right through it. Add organic matter to your soil, and now that soil will hold on to the moisture longer. So compost, all kinds of other options, whatever you have available to you, amend your soil with that organic matter, and that'll help retain some of the water as well. And then mulching. Mulching, or a living mulch, a low ground cover plant that can protect the soil from the sun, that will also help hold moisture in the soil. And it's a little counterintuitive. You'd think, well, if I have plants growing like a clover, for instance, or any other small ground cover, thyme is a wonderful ground cover. I like to grow creeping thyme. There are lots of those kind of plants that you can grow on your garden beds with your vegetable plants growing in those beds. And the common assumption is any plants you have growing in a bed are going to rob moisture from the plants in that bed. That's why we pull weeds, because they can rob the water from the plants we want to grow. And that's true. But if you're growing a shallow-rooted plant as that living mulch, it's going to keep the soil cooler, which reduces evaporation. It's going to absorb some of the moisture in the soil, but more moisture would be lost through the evaporation of an uncovered soil than will be lost from the plants that you're growing. And so if you grow something like an herb that you can also use, or another plant that you can eat, you get double benefit. And if it's in a bed where the primary roots of the plants in that bed, maybe a chili pepper or a tomato, those roots are going to be much deeper. So those shallow rooted cover crops really aren't interfering with the main plants in the bed. As long as you're watering correctly, as long as you're checking the moisture levels of the soil and then giving the plants the water they need. So mulch, living mulch, shade cloth, organic matter in the soil, those are really some of the key ways that you can garden in an area that is dry, like the mountains of Colorado and like the Middle East in particular. There are some, I haven't seen a lot of videos. I worked with the director of the Master Gardener program almost 20 years ago, had done some work in Israel where they used an underground watering system, and it was incredible. And so basically in big garden areas, and similar to the idea we think of with drip irrigation, where they have these lines of water and the water seeps out of the emitters through these lines that are buried underneath the soil and or mulch. So there's another great way to save water in a dry region. Mulching is important, but if you water on top of the mulch and let that water seep through, the mulch is going to absorb some of that moisture. But if you put the watering underneath the mulch, now you're directly watering the soil and you're not losing any moisture through the mulch, collecting it and then evaporating into the air. So I know Israel in particular, I wouldn't be surprised if it's not being used in other areas of the Middle East as well. Underground irrigation through those lines that emit water. And I know at least here in the States, Home Depot and Lowe's sell those those water lines that have emitters built into the line at varying intervals, like every 6 inches. You can take those and bury them underneath your mulch. Very effective way to water. So think about that. Add that to your toolkit in your garden if you live in a dry region as well. Watering from underneath the mulch may be the most effective way you can do it. So before I forget, I want to go ahead and highlight the background today. This is part of the garden of Mike Vornado in Louisiana, and shared this picture with me along with a few others. Just wanted to highlight The bags growing, really nice grow bags, lots of green. The trellis system, you can't see it in this picture, but he also has a pretty extensive network of cinder block, the concrete block garden beds. And I wanted to highlight this, as I do so often with those of you who share the photos with me. Great examples of how you can do so many different things. You can grow in whiskey barrels like this, or cloth bags like this, or the concrete blocks in the background. Cattle panel trellising like this to make a big archway. I see this and I just imagine the whole thing is covered with a vining plant. And a trellis this long, imagine, you can see how the grow bags are set up here. But imagine setting up a system like that, and in one area you're growing tomatoes, and in another area you're growing squash, and another area you're growing melons. And so one of the nice things about a trellis like this with the cattle panels is they're strong enough to be able to support just about anything that you want to grow up those trellises. And you can do it from both sides depending on the plants that you're using. Underneath the trellis, now it's all shaded, and you have an opportunity to actually grow inside an archway like this. Now, I'm not sure if Mike's planning on doing that, but consider that in containers or in the ground. If you have built a big arch to use as a trellis, a walkway through your garden, don't be afraid to grow plants inside that will benefit from some shade from the plants that are growing on the outside. So just love that idea. You can also see some wire set up here to help control or trellis other plants growing in this area. So really nice. Now, Louisiana is one of those states that gets a lot of water, and it is so low in elevation. My garden's at 7,500 feet. Most gardens in Louisiana are only maybe a dozen feet above sea level. So the water table is extremely high. You might have water just a few inches below the soil surface, which is why I'm guessing Mike's doing so much growing in the bags, because my son lives in Louisiana and he has this issue. The ground is just saturated all the time. It's just always too wet. Well, if your ground is too wet, then don't grow in the ground. Grow in containers or raised beds, or some way to raise your plants up above that saturated soil. And so, depending on what you're growing and how deep the roots are, you might be able to incorporate some of the water that's in the ground with your container, and that groundwater may help reduce the amount of water you need, because the base of a grow bag, a cloth grow bag like this, is probably going to stay consistently moist because the ground is consistently moist just because of this region in particular. And so think about those aspects when you water your plants. What's your ground like, and how is your ground impacting the container you're growing in? And it may have an impact on how much you need to water. Cloth grow bags can wick up moisture from the soil if the soil is saturated from a lot of rain or just a naturally high water table. So something to think about. So thank you, Mike, for sharing this with me. I appreciate it. You can see some other trees around the edges here. And garden space is much bigger than this, but just wanted to share this aspect in particular. I have some others that are queued up, ready to go. And I always put out the request if you want to show your garden for a background on my videos on Monday, send them to gardenerscott@gardenerscott.com. Do make sure that you take a picture in landscape or horizontal mode, if you will. That will enable me to show the whole picture. If you send it to me vertically, then I'm going to have to cut it off. It just doesn't fit as a backdrop. And give me permission to use it if you would, so that I can show it and know that I'm showing it with your blessings, as Mike did in this case. So nice to see green areas growing and some ideas. I've got one archway that's a double cattle panel, and I've got another arch that's a single cattle panel. I like the idea of this one, which is 6 cattle panels. So cattle panels are 50 inches, and so to have these 6, that's 300 inches that are rolling through this archway. And so if you think about that, it's about 25 feet all covered, and I bet that's going to look beautiful once the plants start growing up. So thanks. That's also another idea you can maybe fit into your garden. Sheena's Garden saying, I watch Gardener Scott all growing season. I always find new nuggets that are helpful, even on old videos. Well, thank you for that. And I try to make my videos so they're timeless, so that you can go back in the old videos and see the progression of gardening through my different gardens since I started making videos. But I appreciate that. That's why I do it, is so I can share what I've done and you can pick up on all that information. Drawing momentum. Last year I lived for Gardener Scott's videos. Learned so much from him. My long-term goal is to turn my whole yard into a garden. Awesome. We actually have in the Colorado State right now in the legislature, they're debating a bill that will encourage homeowners to stop growing grass lawns and turn them into gardens, front yard and backyard, for the water considerations. We're in a severe drought. We're not getting the rainfall. Lawns take up a lot of water that isn't necessary, and you can convert a lawn into a beautiful garden space and cut the amount of water that you're using dramatically. So good for you. I love that idea that you want to turn your whole yard into a garden. That's exactly my approach as well. Much of it because I like that look, but a big part of it as well is just the water requirements. If you choose the right kind of plants, if you choose native plants, if you amend the soil, if you mulch, if you plan ahead, you can dramatically cut how much watering you're doing and how much water your plants need by getting rid of the lawn and putting in a beautiful garden instead. And so I've heard this, Bettina. Bettina says cattle panels are exorbitantly expensive north of the border. Have 2 tunnels of 2 panels only. Would love to have more. And I haven't bought cattle panels in a few years, but I've heard that the cost has dramatically gone up, in addition to so many other things. So the nice thing about the cattle panel, if you're considering it, anyone at some point, is it is a long-term investment. They last and will last for years and years and years. The steel is just so thick and so heavy, and it's galvanized. It's going to last a long time. So if you're thinking about it and wondering if it's worth the cost, look ahead towards the years that you'll still be able to use it and amortize the cost over that time, and maybe that'll make it a little bit easier to decide if that's what you want to do. Yoga Lai says, I'm trying to get rid of grass bit by bit. It's not easy. No, it is not easy. But your approach is exactly the way to do it, bit by bit. I was lucky enough when I moved into this house that I just stripped everything and started from scratch, which is why there's a lot of areas of my garden where things aren't growing. So my approach was to start with nothing and then bit by bit put plants in. If you've already got all that grass and you want to get rid of it, well, same basic idea. But now, bit by bit, you have to reclaim the area where the grass is growing and then put your plants in containers or cover the soil. The approach I'm taking for most of my areas is to put cardboard down on the grass to smother it, or the weeds, I should say, because the grass is gone, but there are weeds popping up. And then on top of that, I use soil that's been amended. And then on top of that, I add a mulch. And that's how I'm reclaiming the areas that used to be lawn, bit by bit, just a little bit at a time. And that may work best for you. Colorado Bird Nerd, nice to see you here. So much great information again today. Thanks. Love mulching. Seems to finish off the look of a flower garden bed so nicely too. I completely agree. Thank you so much for that super chat. I completely agree that mulch, and I'm guilty of this to some degree as well. The benefits of mulch are so many that most of us tend to focus on using mulch to protect the soil, to keep the water from evaporating, and to, especially if you're using organic mulch, to benefit the soil microbes for the food it provides as it decomposes. But the visual aspect, choosing the mulch that looks good for a garden, I think is a huge benefit that too many gardens really don't think about. We think about the practicality of mulch and what it's going to do for our soil and plants. Choose a mulch that looks good. And so in my front, I have chosen mulches with that thought in mind. I use shredded, dyed, colored mulch, and I like that because I like the look of it. In the back area, I just use wood chips because the look isn't as important to me. I don't have to worry about whatever the dye is, about the color changing over time, but that's how I approach it. Some of my mulches are specifically chosen to look good. Other mulches are chosen because of the benefits they offer. So don't discount, like Colorado Bird Nerd, choose some of your mulches to look good. Don't discount that as an option, and it's easy. It's an easy way to make the garden look good. All right, Tom, thank you for that super chat. Have you tried or seen anything about using Olgas or Hoyas? I don't know about Olgas, but Hoyas or Olas is a way to water a garden. If you're talking about the clay pots that you bury in the ground and then you put the water into the clay pot and the water seeps out, an Oya, if that's what you're talking about, go ahead and let me know here. Yes, and that is actually, I talked about it in a stream a couple weeks ago, I think. That is something I'm planning on doing this year, is to use some of the Oyas, O-L-L-A, in the garden. And it can be, especially for dry regions, it can be a way to reduce the soil evaporation by having a buried pot, and it is usually terracotta clay. So when you put the water in the pot, it seeps out the sides of the clay pot and then keeps the soil around it evenly moist. Quite effective. A lot of Native American cultures and some of the Mexican and Spanish cultures in the southwest of the U.S. have used that as part of their gardening for generations. And so I am planning on experimenting with that this year. I'll be making my own. You'll see that video coming, and we'll see how that works. Because if you buy them, they can be a bit expensive because the companies that make them and sell them realize that gardeners are buying them and willing to pay a lot for them. So yes, if that's what you're talking about, then in a dry region in particular, it can be a really beneficial. So I'm going to scroll down and see if that is indeed what you are looking for. I haven't seen a backup comment yet. Maybe I missed it. Yeah, definitely an option for keeping the soil evenly moist with minimal watering. And depending on the size of the Oya, you can water it, and that water may take 2 or 3 days to seep out. And so in a hot, dry region, you don't have to water every single day. You can just fill this buried pot every 3 or 4 days and then walk away. I mean, what's easier than that? To just let a buried pot water your garden for you. So that's why I want to experiment in some of the new beds that I still have to build and that I'm still developing, that I talked about, that's delaying some of my planting, is to anticipate the plans, like getting these pots and burying them, to reduce my watering, because the more beds I make, the more work required, because I like to hand water everything. So I love being out in my garden for 2 hours in the summer seeing my plants, but by the end of the summer it does get a little old having to be out there every single day and knowing that I have to spend 2 hours just to water every single day. So it does get a little bit old. And so that leads in with this next bit that I wanted to talk about is, for so many of us, it's so easy to, about this time of year, just get discouraged. The spring has hit for many of us. We're seeing the plants start to pop up. We're starting to put the seeds in the ground. We're putting the transplants out, and it's wonderful. But what if it doesn't go according to plan? Over the course of the winter, if you do it like I do it, you've created your plan, you have your schedule in mind, you even have your calendar with what's written on the plants and the seeds you're going to put out at specific times, and you're ready in December and January and February to make all that happen. What happens when the weather doesn't cooperate? Or you have an injury, or some type of family emergency, or a vacation, who knows? But something gets in the way and you can't follow through with your plan, with what you had scheduled to do. Well, don't get discouraged. I had planned to put a lot more plants and seeds in the ground by now, but we got no rain. We had extremely high winds. The cold lasted longer than anticipated. And then it was extremely hot, and it was cold again. And so I'm about 2 weeks behind where I want to be, which means some of those beds that I was going to construct that didn't get constructed still need to be constructed. Priorities. What's more important, putting plants in the ground or building a bed? For most of us, it's putting plants in the ground. For me, that's what I did last year. I put plants in the ground and did not put the beds in that I wanted to do last year. So I'm a year behind in putting those beds in, which now means I can't put any plants in those beds this year because those beds don't exist. So I'm sacrificing some of my effort, some of my work time to not put plants in so that I can complete some of these garden projects that I have. That's my choice. But it would be so easy for me to just throw my hands up and say, I can't do it. I'm giving up. It's just too much. Well, you don't have to do it all. You can be selective. If you're pregnant and not getting out in the garden, it's okay. Be selective about what you are going to do. And you can make your plant choices and the amount of time and effort you're putting out in the garden match with your capabilities. If you are focused on growing food for your family, and then suddenly you realize as a brand new gardener, you put your seeds in too early and you have a frost or freeze hit at the normal time, but you hadn't learned yet about average last frost date, and now you've lost your entire planting, don't get discouraged. Just start over again. I've mentioned this before. I mentioned it a couple weeks ago. 1 year, I started my garden 3 times because the weather devastated my garden. Each time, started again, devastated again. The 3rd time, I was able to get the garden to survive through the season. Not all the plants made it to harvest point because in my short season, losing those 2 to 3 weeks can be critical. But at least I got the plants out. At least I was gardening. I was learning from that experience. So even when things don't go your way, learn from it. Use it as much to your benefit as possible and move forward. Just don't be so discouraged because all of us are encountering weather issues of one sort or another right now. Too much rain, not enough rain. Too much wind, not enough wind. And I'm saying that facetiously because it's hard to say that there's not enough wind. But I actually had someone comment a while back, not through the Gardner Scott channel, but through a conversation where they didn't have the wind to support the windmills that they had in their region. And so sometimes you don't get the wind you're looking for. If you're generating your electricity with a windmill, you want wind. But even then, too much wind can be devastating. Whatever is happening to you, just don't let it discourage getting out in the garden and participating with nature in your garden. I've cut back my plan. I'm not going to be growing as much as I had planned. I'm not going to be making some videos I had planned about those things I was going to be growing. That's okay. I'm not losing sleep at night. I'm still getting out there and doing the things I need to do, and I'm okay with that. And you should be okay with the plan that changes, with the weather that doesn't cooperate, and maybe with a garden that's not as big as you had hoped it would be. And if you approach it from that perspective, you can get out there, you can be happy, you can enjoy it, and that's what it's all about. So do that. Get out in the garden, be happy, do what you can do, modify the plan in whatever way you need to do to modify it, and above all, enjoy gardening. I'm Gardener Scott. I'll see you here next Monday for a lot more gardening information. Hope you have a great gardening week.